Hello, and welcome to Parrot Analytics' Global Demand Awards, where we are highlighting the best and brightest in entertainment across film, television, talent. And this year, I'm very excited to talk about gaming. I have with me today Derick Tsai, who is the head of the Destiny Universe Transmedia at Bungie. And Derick and I are going to get into a very exciting conversation about the future of gaming and television and film and animation and how all these different worlds come together. But Derick, first and foremost, I have to ask you, have you watched HBO's Last of Us yet?
I did, and I loved it. What were your thoughts about it?
It's so funny that it premiered right before we are going to jump into this conversation because I think it touched upon so much of what you and I have had many conversations about over the last few months about how you do a successful gaming adaptation, how you take story from an interactive medium and bring it to a linear medium, and how you find ways to deepen a story that players already know so well. What were your thoughts on it?
You know what's funny? I thought it was like the kind of end result of also like how the industry has just gotten better at like big genre IP in general. So it's like, they got better at fantasy, right? So like this big genre thing I think started like early 2000s with like Fellowship of the Ring and the Harry Potter films. And when I was watching fantasy back in the day, you never think you get like a Lord of the Rings film. And then like the superhero stuff got so good where you get like a Logan, which was almost like a prestige superhero film. And I feel like something like The Last of Us benefits from like how fantasy and comics have gotten better, and it's like almost like the apotheosis of like the medium, because I was watching it going, this is like blockbuster scope, but it's got that prestige appeal, and somehow they like put the two together. And I think like Thrones also helped it, and I felt like The Last of Us was just this thing that like built upon all the kind of like progress you've seen in the other IP adaptations and all the big genre stuff, and you get this thing that was like, I was into it because I knew the game. My wife was into it and like freaking out. And it was like really like resonant. And it didn't even need to be a gaming IP. It was just like this incredible drama that's probably going to like rip my heart out. You know what I mean? So I thought it was like stood alone on its own, but then like broader, kind of like in terms of like the broader industry, you really did see how it was building upon all this other stuff that came before it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, the reason that I wanted to bring you into the awards this year was because when we were thinking about the theme of what we wanted to do, we were looking at all these different shows, whether it be The Witcher, whether it be Arcane, both are on Netflix. One's live action, one is a animated series, whether it's The Legend of Vox Machina over on Amazon
Right.
Prime Video, whether it is Halo on Paramount Plus, or Sonic the Hedgehog, Detective Pikachu. It kind of felt like gaming in the last few years has become the comic book adaptation of the 2020s, right? Where we saw the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC universe really come into their own in the late 2000s, early 2000s and 10s. Right now, we are looking at movie studios and television studios and game companies, including Bungie, point at all of this and say that gaming IP can do for the new generation of viewers and audiences what comic book IP did. So how excited are you for the next decade?
I mean, I'm super excited. I grew up on games, and I grew up on games, comics, and fantasy. So seeing comics and fantasy kind of take off, games was like the next natural evolution, and it's been great, especially in the last like few years, like maybe like 5 years or so. You and I have talked about this. It's like the stuff just has gotten better, which makes me more excited because I was in the comics. Like I remember those like Roger Corman Fantastic Four films, and I'm reading like these Jack Kirby comics, thinking like we can do so much better than this. But like it was like this Roger Corman film, and eventually you get something like the MCU, and I think like gaming is like set up for that. I think gaming is really set up for that. I think the future is really bright.
So digging into this as someone who is going to help craft the future in many ways of what this kind of gaming extension can become, what inspirations do you take from the several last decades of game adaptations, but also this landmark push we've seen into the kind of multi-project, multi-platform franchise development?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it, like I mentioned before, is just like the stuff has gotten better. And I think that's a combo of a few things, right? So that's kind of like you're learning how to tell these kinds of stories. How do you translate something from interactive to like linear? And the big one is like in the game, you're ostensibly like the hero. You're the author. You're authoring that experience. Whereas like in linear media, kind of like, movies, TV, comics, or whatever, like it's more like character focused. So it's just like learning how to like maintain what makes the IP, like the pillar, so to speak, but make it more like character centric, right? So I think that's like you're learning how to tell stories that way. And I think a lot of it too is just like the audience has just gotten more used to this kind of stuff. So they're just more accepting, like they don't bump on it as much. Like I said, the other mediums have kind of like done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of like getting an audience acclimated to these kind of like big stories and secondary worlds. And in terms of like the kind of franchise push, it's like, I always go back to two things, which is like Star Wars and Pokemon, right? So it's like it's been done before, but now these kind of gaming IPs are evolving into like full on like franchises where it's like there's a mothership medium and then there's all these different other mediums kind of like going up to the mothership as platform, as like kind of on ramps onto this, like, into this universe, into the story. And, and then the next trick is just figuring out how to like tile them together. When do you deploy like a specific medium and why? And like, how does it evolve the IP? When do you do it and why?
It's so interesting that you brought up Pokemon because I was thinking about this last year. We saw that the Pokemon company, alongside Nintendo, alongside their television partners, were finally going to end Ash Ketchum's story. They were finally going to be like, Ash Ketchum, after I think nearly like 30 years, was finally going to retire and they were going to move on. And it was interesting because the latest Pokemon games had just come out and there was this generation of 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds who had the same affection and affiliation with Ash Ketchum that 31, 32, 33-year-olds had. And I'm interested to know, as someone who is now at a company that players really love, and as someone who has worked at companies that have global players, millions, tens of millions of players, is there that extra level of concern when it comes to thinking about ways to expand those franchises? Do you find that there's an extra pressure that comes with that? Or do you think, to your earlier point, that because consumers are more used to this now, because we've seen it with the comic book adaptations and we've seen it with other franchise development, that audiences are a little bit more accepting with experimentation?
That's a loaded question. It's a big question. And I think there isn't, like, I would say, like, I'm going to speak very broadly and not like relating to anything we're doing at
Yeah.
Bungie. But I would say, like, before, I kind of got into like, like games and whatnot, like I started in the marketing business. And there's always this thing, which was like expanding is always really tough because sometimes you have to let go you have to let go of what you have to go for what you want. And there's just like all these case studies in terms of like rebranding, brand expansions going like horribly wrong. And I think a lot of it is like, as long as you can like stick true to the IP and the pillars of the IP and the core of the IP, I think fans are going to be a lot more accepting, right? So it's like, let's talk about House of the Dragon. It's a new thing, but if like it's a new thing, but then like 15 minutes in, I was like, this feels like season 4 of Thrones, and I was like right back into it. You know what I mean? And it was like, it's a smaller story, it's more contained, it's more messy. You and I have joked about it's got like a reality TV vibe to it of just like really messy characters, like just really kind of like Real Housewives type characters, And like it's a different side of Thrones, but it still feels like Thrones. And I think when people kind of when fans get very unhappy is when it doesn't feel like the IP. I think normally like that's a thing that I always see, like, folks like bumping on, whereas like, so say something like Arcane, like it felt like the game, it really felt like the game, and it felt like the marketing around the game, and it felt like all the cinematics and all the commercials. So even though it was like a different take on it, and it was like a really long story compared to like these commercials that Riot had been doing, it felt like the IP. And I think that's why fans embraced it.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about a lot, and I know you and I have discussed it. This idea of what gaming adaptations used to be, and not that every gaming adaptation from 20 years ago was terrible by any means. I mean,
Right.
there's a lot that I still really love, but it almost felt like there was this absurdist approach to adapting a game. It came from a
Yes.
place of, this feels like IP that is successful on a PS2 or successful for a Windows PC, and therefore we are going to try and bring that into the Hollywood system. And now it kind of feels like the Hollywood system is including showrunners and producers and writers who have grown up with these types of games, or have grown up with gaming in general, and understand that a large approach to adapting a game, which can be really daunting because it's such a character directed, immersive, and interactive experience, which does not always pair well with linear, has started to change. And that gets into what you were saying earlier, and I really wanted to touch upon it again, which is at the core of all of these different adaptations and franchise, no matter what the genre, everything comes down to character and story development. This is something that you and I have talked about all the time. What is the secret sauce? Turns out it's good characters. Part of that character and story development, especially in a world that combines gaming visuals that players know and traditional film and television styles that audiences know, is using different formats to try and approach storytelling. It's actually a luxury, I think, that a lot of gaming adaptation can pull from when we look at extraordinarily in-demand titles like Castlevania and Arcane, for example, on the animation side. What's your thinking on the different formats and different approaches to these types of story and character development?
Sure. Like in terms of like transmedia, the way I always look at it is like each specific medium has a specific story that it hosts or like tells stories the best. So if it's something internal and you're really inside the thoughts of the characters, it's probably going to be a novel, right? Because it's like nothing can get you inside the head of a character like a novel. Like as much as I love Thrones, like the show, the books are always kind of better just because you're like inside Tyrion's brain. You're inside like Daenerys' like just like thinking process. So it's like if it's something internal, it's probably going to be like a novel would be great. If it's something that you need to be in a physical space or it's really about immersion, then maybe it's like VR or actually just physical immersion. You know what I mean? If it's like long form, something like TV might be the best, But if it's something more spectacle based, then like a live action movie or like a theatrical experience would be the best. So it just really depends on like what is the purpose for deploying this specific medium? What story are you trying to tell in this medium? And then just kind of like what would be the best medium to kind of like tell the story, basically. But I always look at like again, like every specific medium just has like a role to me, like so like classic like Western comics that I grew up on. I see the way like Marvel uses it. Like they use it to like test out ideas because like to test those ideas that crazy, like in live action, it's just cost prohibitive. But you can test it out in a comic format and figure out like what about it works and what about it doesn't work and almost use it as R&D for the films. And you see they're adapting stuff from comics. Like at first they were adapting stuff from when I grew up, which was like the Infinity Gauntlet series, that was like 20 plus years ago, maybe even more now. It's like depressing. But now they're adapting stuff from like Secret Wars, which was like not too long ago. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't know what they'll adapt from Secret Wars. They'll probably take pieces of it, but you need it to exist as a comic first before you can start like adapting it. So it just depends on like, what story you're trying to tell, what medium do you think is best told in.
Well, I think that's what's so fascinating about your specific role. And I think it's a role that we'll see a lot more companies across both traditional entertainment on the linear side, and also within the gaming world. You see companies like Bungie, companies like Ubisoft, companies like Nintendo, even partnering with Illumination to kind of figure out how they
Right.
can continue those stories in different formats. But the idea of transmedia in general really is this idea that this share of attention that consumers have is getting much smaller in many ways because there's so much competition, and
Right.
gaming is becoming is not, excuse me, is not becoming, it is the dominant force of
Yes.
entertainment globally. And so how do you continue that evolution of keeping players inside that world even when they've put the controller away for a little bit? And so, in your experience as someone who is now again shaping a lot of this, but also is spending a lot of time, and I know this because Derick and I will text or send emails, I know that you're thinking about it constantly. How have the worlds of gaming and traditional entertainment merged more than ever over the last decade?
Yeah, that's a good one. And it's like there's a few ways. I think like one main way is just like the adaptations will just keep happening, right? So it's like adaptations is like taking a story from one thing and just putting it in another medium. So that's just going to keep happening, and the studios are getting better at it, and the storytellers are getting better. And as you get more reps, those things will just get better. I think the second one is like integration. Prior to Bungie, I was like producing and directing animation over at Riot, and I think Riot honestly pioneered a lot of this, where it's like they would integrate different parts of their ecosystem for this whole experience. So something like Worlds, right? Which was like, I was there during COVID, so I didn't get to experience it, but just like watching it happen, it was like there was the music element, there was a gaming element, there was an event element, and it was all together in this like rock concert, basically. I'd never seen anything like that before. And then when Arcane was launching, like all the different products of Riot had content that basically helped support the launch of this animated film, and then there was like consumer products around it, and it was like this whole ecosystem that connected to different parts of itself just to like launch this thing, which was super exciting. So there's adaptation, there's integration, and the last category, I'm going to just call it Fortnite because I don't know what else to call it. It was just like watching this thing evolve over the last few years was like it's a medium now to experience other mediums, right? You can go to a concert. It's like I still like going to concerts live, but watching like the Ariana Grande and the Travis Scott thing, I'm like, this is like a whole new medium because you can just run around it, which was crazy, and then you can watch Inception inside the game during Epic Movie Night, or like some of their events, it's like a scene from Pacific Rim just breaks out like in the middle of like the game. You know what I mean? So it's just like I don't even know it's probably like a new kind of medium at this point. I just call it Fortnite because I don't know what else to call it. Call it the blend or whatever. It's just like I've never seen anything like this. It's basically like Ready Player One, like for reals. So I think those are the ways they kind of integrate, but that they kind of merge. But to your point about once you put the controller down, that's like the magic phrase. And like I just hung out with my nieces and nephews, and I always look to kids to see what's next because it's basically like they're going to be driving a lot of this. They're obsessed with Pokemon. They're just obsessed with it. So they played like I just watched like hung out with them for like 2 full days, and it was just Pokemon nonstop. And it's like they play Scarlet, Violet, I think it's the name of the game, right? then they showed me their binders of trading cards. And then, my wife and I got them this like 2000 piece Lego thing of Gyarados. It's like the Sea Dragon thing. And then they just spent all night like putting it together. And the amount of engagement that IP has in that household, I was like, this is amazing. Like right when they put it down, there's something there. There's another thing to engage with that like touches another pleasure center or something. And I think that's like the true value of these things is like, I guess the best way I can put it is like there's always something to get into, right? Once you put the controller down.
Yeah, I think you actually touched upon something really important with Fortnite, which I just want to go back to for a second, because I think people still see Fortnite as a game, and that is predominantly what it is. It is still a game, but in the way that Google became a verb and Uber became a verb, Fortnite in many ways has become this definitive world building experience alongside Roblox and Minecraft, where it's become more than just what it was ever intended to do. And I think a big part of what you said about Pokemon is kind of in the reverse at companies like Disney, where they look at a Fortnite and they don't want to get into game publishing, but they realize the vital importance of their IP. And their way to kind of be in this transmedia world is to license out skins and develop these types of additional buy-ons for players within the world of Roblox or within the world of Fortnite, to be able to have those players literally take on the identity of their favorite superhero. And then a part of their transmedia experience as well is at the parks. It's arguably the most definitive transmedia experience, is building that level of adoration and love through intimate physical experience at a playground, effectively, that people love from all different ages. And I think gaming companies like Bungie, like Epic, like Nintendo are on the forefront of being able to say, what Star Wars was for this generation, for my generation, we think gaming will be able to do across all these different platforms for the
Right.
next generation and the one after that.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this because you mentioned the parks. Like, I'm really curious to see how this stuff evolves, right? Like, do you think like dressing up as like a character skin in Fortnite will replace like you walking up as a kid to Pluto and like touching Pluto at the park? Or do you think it's like, because I always wonder, like, Fortnite is kind of a theme park in a way, I guess. It's kind of how I see it. So, do you think they're analogous? Do you think they're going to replace each other? Like, what do you think about this?
I think one is more cost effective, and so it allows experience and it allows communal activity to happen no matter what the price of that experience. So you could have let's say 10 years from now, you could have the top of the line VR device, probably from an Apple, or an HTC, or you could have a version of the Meta Quest that is maybe selling for $80 10 years from now. That's kind of a basic version, but everyone can kind of have this communal experience within a theme park, and they can go and explore. And I don't think it ever replaces the physicality of theme park. I don't think it ever replaces being a 7-year-old and hugging Mickey Mouse, or being able to, go and,
Right.
and pretend to have a lightsaber battle with Kylo Ren, like, or whoever the Star Wars villain is in a decade. But all of those things are fundamentally part of this idea that we're talking about, which is continuing a world. So I would love to know, how does approaching the continuation of a gaming world, which by definition is very interactive,
Right.
change when you're thinking about the more linear side of entertainment?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of it is like kind of mentioned before is as a player, you're authoring that experience. You're driving a lot of it. Unless you're playing like a really authored character in a set storyline, but you're still making like tons of the decisions during like the battle parts. I would say like, as you make that transition into like linear media, you have to like really focus on the characters. And I think a lot of it is like grounding a character in this like usually like fantastic space. And I think that's like the biggest thing to I think that's the biggest adjustment, because like if you're a player, you want to go through probably the most fantastic world possible, and there's a big focus on like the world building, which I think is super important, like the quote unquote story world. But I think when you go to linear, it's really about how the story world like drives the characters. And the example I always use is like, I really love the Black Panther IP, and I guess I like Vibranium as much as the next guy. But really, like Vibranium by itself, I'm like, yeah, this is pretty cool. But really, what's interesting is what it makes T'Challa and Eric do. Like the links it drives those two guys do is like actually what makes it fascinating. So it's really about how the story world like drives the characters, and I think that's like really the main adjustment. And then after that, it's just a matter of like translation's tough, right? So it's like, how do you maintain like enough qualities of the IP where, you know, you get your core audience, like you basically get the core players, like players who've been playing it, but also make it kind of like quote unquote digestible enough and like resonant enough for like a quote unquote general audience, right? So it's like you're always walking that fine line trying to figure it out. And I think like I actually think Uncharted actually did a good job, and The Last of Us did a great job, which they both felt faithful to me, but they also were like really you know, I guess like you know, desirable to watch for like a general audience. And you know, you and I talk about Thrones a lot. I thought that IP and that adaptation did it about as well as you can do it, where it's like it is one of the craziest worlds out there, but they really just grounded it in character and presented it as an HBO drama. And like if you go back and watch like the posters, they didn't show a dragon on a poster till season 3.
Mhm.
You know, so it was like season 1 poster was just a guy on a chair, and it was like, oh, this is our new Tony Soprano, Walter White. It's a very complicated guy in a chair. And then the season 2 poster was like a fist holding a crown, and it was just like it was a political drama. And season 3 is when they finally put the dragon on the poster. It's like, oh, we can tell you it's like a fantasy show now. So it was like something that was incredibly faithful, but then they presented it in a way where like it was you know, desirable to watch for like a general audience.
It's a really, really good point. I actually have never thought about how the poster design of Thrones has like
Yeah.
impacted the idea from what audiences thought of an HBO show did for that
Right.
show. And I think something that you mentioned that's really important is making an adaptation feel fundamentally um uh is making an adaptation fundamentally feel very welcoming. And a great example of this, and this is effectively just the Pokemon fan club now, but when we look at what Pokemon did, right? Pokemon the game, which debuted first, what
Right.
games do exceptionally well, as you know, is they make players directors. Directors get to choose what their journey is. They can choose whether they want to go on side quests and turn a 12-hour game into a 24-hour game, or they can do a 12-hour game in 6 hours by just doing the main quest. And Pokemon is an open world role playing game. And so well, now it is. It used to be a role playing game. And you go on your different Pokemon adventures and you were in control. And by bringing in a 10-year-old boy in the form of Ash Ketchum that always had this Pokemon walking by him, you have taken the player and put them in this visual form of a different director, which is Ash Ketchum, and you follow him on the journey, which might be more appealing to those who don't want to be on their own adventure. And I think that's a really subtle but important way to kind of approach the difference in letting a player choose what's going to happen versus allowing a viewer to take a ride with someone.
Right.
And before we get into our next question, the thing I want to reiterate is the reason the theme of this awards this year is level up is because we've seen so many video game adaptations reach that exceptional level of demand, which is about this, 0.2% of all shows, both in the US and then globally, if we look at it. And that includes, again, things like The Witcher and Arcane. It includes movies like Detective Pikachu and Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I'm sure it will include Super Mario World when that comes out this March or April, I'm sure. So again, because we've seen a lot of these gaming adaptations find huge success, why do you think there is a much more encompassing of these adaptations from audiences than in the past? Is it just that the audience now has grown up with games being a constant part of their life, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think it's like a confluence of a bunch of factors, right? Like one is kind of, you mentioned like, you know, saturation. So like games have been around long enough now where the audience is used to it, and the filmmakers making it like grew up on it. So I think, but it also dovetails into the other thing that we've been talking about, which is like the familiarity, right? So it's like a lot of these games are like big genre IPs or like big secondary world, science fiction, fantasy. And I think like, I honestly think like Potter, Lord of the Rings, MCU kind of soften people up, and Dune just soften people up for this kind of stuff. Like you don't have to explain as much. People just kind of get it. You know what I mean? So I think there's a familiarity with the audience, and also like the storytellers have learned to tell these stories better. Two is like production. It's like digital effects have just gotten better, so the worlds are more believable. Like the 1993 Super Mario movie was like rough, but I also didn't know how you were supposed to do Super Mario. Like really, like how are you supposed to do it? You know what I mean? They did the best they could, I guess. But I'm like, I don't even know how to do a Super Mario movie back then, unless it was like animated or something. And now Pikachu was great. Like his cheeks and just like the animation, it was like so cute and so fun. And I think that's part of it too. Like the production has gotten better. I think three, like the stories have just gotten so good. Like Mass Effect, Last of Us, like the God of War stuff is like really amazing. And I think I put the stories right up against anything in like TV and film or comics or whatever. I just think the stories have gotten so much better. And now it's finally respected as a quote unquote art form, which is great. And then the last thing is what you talked about is that I don't know if gaming is a center of culture, but if it's not, it's pretty freaking close. It's like right in there. Whereas before it was this thing kind of on the fringes, and comics were like that too. I saw comics go through this entire journey of being this like weird kind of like fringe medium that you kind of look down upon, and then it was seen as art, and now it's a center of the culture. And I think games is basically like right behind it, driving everything. I think like those factors working together basically just there's like an audience who just like really wants this stuff now. It's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, it's always very funny to me when gaming gets separated from entertainment.
Yeah.
It makes triple what film and television and music do, but
It does, yeah.
it's exactly that. Um, you and I have talked again about this in the past, the importance of character and these types of big world adaptations.
Right.
How do you think of approaching character when the base is a player driven open world game? And for those who are watching who may not be familiar with that, that is your Skyrim, that is your type of video game that you can sink hundreds of hours into and still not complete because you're just exploring the different world, versus a Last of Us or a God of War is much more narrative driven, quest by quest type of adventure.
Yeah, I mean, like my favorite game of all time is an open world game. It's Zelda Breath of the Wild, right? I've spent like God, probably like 1,000 hours playing that thing, but I couldn't tell you the first thing really about Link, except like he gets really happy when you like cook something, he like jumps and he's super excited. But like I don't know anything about this guy, and I think if you're trying to adapt to one of those games, you really just need to build that character. Like, what is that character's wants? What are their needs? What drives them? What are their idiosyncrasies? What are their quirks? Like, I'm excited to see Mario because I don't know anything about Mario. I just know he's got a brother and he's a plumber, and that's kind of the end of it, right? And it's like whatever they do, I have no idea what drives that guy or like what his deal is. And I'm really excited to see the movie to see how they flesh it out. So I think the big challenge is like in an open world game where it's like you're building your character from scratch, or like Link, which is like kind of a blank character, you're gonna have to really just build that character out, but make it feel like the IP and the world that players are used to. So it's like again, like a super delicate balance of like how do you bring new things in the IP but still make it feel like it's the thing, right? Because otherwise, like fans will just freak out and just go, "Well, that's not Mario, that's not Link." Da, 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 da. You saw a little bit of it with the Mario when the commercials came out, but as you see more commercials, I've seen like more of my friends and just like the audiences get more and more into it.
Yeah. Couple more questions for you. I'm so thankful that you took some time out of your busy day crafting the next big potential, whatever it might be, to talk to us. But, second last question for you. What about this moment in the industry? And the industry is going through a period of revolutionary change. I compare it from going from theater to film and then from film to television, more so than just from DVD to streaming. What about this moment in the industry makes it the perfect time for more gaming adaptations, or adaptations into traditional entertainment?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of like what we chatted about before. It's just like basically the industry needs more stuff to adapt, right? And I think like you went through, I've been revisiting John Grisham movies, and there was a phase in the 90s and early aughts where they were just adapting every one of those. So they chewed through all the legal stuff, then they chewed through all the comic stuff, and I guess gaming is next. And I think a lot of it is like it's the insatiable appetite for IP, which is a code for like mitigating risk, right? Because they want the next big thing, they want a built-in audience, and a lot of these games come with gigantic built-in audiences. Like hundreds of millions of people play League of Legends like every month. That's why it's like League of Legends was so attractive, right? So I think one is like these games come with huge audiences. Two, like I mentioned before, is just the appetite for these worlds for people to get like lost in. I think streamers, companies see like how much people will invest in a world. Just the amount of time I've spent, you and I have talked about this, and you've ridiculed me for this, like the amount of time I've spent on Game of Thrones, right? Audiobooks alone, probably 2,000 hours. You factor in the shows and just the amount of time I've talked about this stupid thing. I have no idea how much money I've spent on it. Just companies see it, you know what I mean? And it's like they're looking for not just the next IP, but the next world for people to get lost in and to kind of, I guess, to engage with like forever in all these different mediums. And I think games right now are like some of the most fertile worlds out there. And I think that's what makes them so appealing.
Lastly, for you, what do you think is one or a few, there might be a couple of different options here, or area that gaming extensions haven't really explored that you're excited to see happen as the moment and as the industry mature, and as more companies and teams get involved in building the future?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it is like, God, you and I have been talking about this forever. And I think what I've kind of gotten used, what I've kind of like come to the conclusion of is I think all the pieces are actually kind of there. And now at this point, it's a matter of like refining and maybe recombining and just seeing how you want to put the pieces together. So I think one is just like continuing to get better to tell these stories. Like Last of Us, to kind of bring it full circle, was amazing. But I don't think Last of Us would have really been possible without something like Logan to show you can go like with this level of emotional complexity and this level of like rawness, I guess, to like tell that kind of story. So I think the industry will just keep getting better at telling these kinds of stories. I think Arcane was also kind of a revelation in terms of like how faithful was the IP, but just the emotional complexities of it. It really shows like games can support those kinds of experiences. And two is more of like kind of like a franchise management thing of like, now you can tell these stories. How do you weave them together? And how do you weave them together over time and across mediums to create those like memories and those moments, right? Until like the end result that everybody wants is that until this story becomes parts of the audience's story, which is like the highest level I think you can get to, especially if you do it over time. And to wrap it back around with Pokemon, it was like, I basically like, I grew up watching it. So I have very fond memories of the animation, of the cartoon, of the anime. I just come home from school, basketball, I would just like watch it, have a laugh. And it kind of fell off as I grew older, but now I have nieces and nephews. And like I mentioned before, it's like, we just spent all weekend engaging with it. And that's going to, I don't get to see them as much as I want to. And now Pokemon is just part of that specific memory. You know what I mean? So I think that's the ultimate level. I get the feeling everyone's trying to get to. And I think as games move forward, it's just like they're going to learn how to tell these stories better. And then how do you weave them together and how do you do it over time to create that like multi-generational love? So I think that's kind of where it's going.
So no pressure on you to kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
Well, Derick, thank you so much for joining us. I know that I will be texting you probably tonight about whatever game I'm playing or show I'm watching. But it's an honor to have you and very excited to see what you and Bungie do over the next few years.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that video from our Global Demand Awards Virtual Festival. Reach out to us today and find out why some of the largest organizations around the globe are partnering with Parrot Analytics to solve some of their most pressing problems.